Hello and welcome to Totally Connected, the podcast series that serves as your portal to New Zealand's tech scene, proudly presented by Entelar Group, the total connection company covering distribution, integrated end-to-end supply chain, IT field delivery and services, and more. Today we're speaking with Brendan Winitana, Executive Chair of SEANZ. Now, SEANZ is the Sustainable Energy Association of New Zealand. It's an independent organisation and they're focused on advocacy, policy, managing industry standards and events, connecting industry professionals and collaborating with electricity industry stakeholders, all with the aim of developing New Zealand's sustainable energy capability and capacity. Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us, Brendan.
My pleasure.
Great to have you with us, Brendan. Now, for the listeners out there, why don't we start where we usually start with a bit of a bio from you? What's your background? What does SEANZ do? Who do you guys represent and who makes up the membership?
Sure. My background is primarily in technology. I come from a background in IT services, communications, .NET or the .com era. Finance, have a strong background in finance, having owned a finance company and a group of IT-based businesses. And besides that, working for a number of corporates, primarily in the IT industry and the imaging industry. So after a period of 25-odd years of doing that, I moved into a role of becoming essentially a professional director, and as such became involved in the SEANZ organisation, firstly as a director of the organisation, and after about 6 months being appointed chair.
It must be a really interesting emerging industry to be part of, Brendan.
Look, it's a really exciting industry. The solar industry is most exciting, especially at residential, commercial, industrial, and at utility scale level. I'm sure most New Zealanders are aware of the development of solar in this country, even though it sits behind the trends in other countries internationally. The take-up here is not as well developed. But that's a really good thing in some ways, primarily because it's lots of lessons learnt, having spent a lot of time in other jurisdictions and other countries understanding what that looks like. We have the advantage here of learning those lessons. So SEANZ essentially is a organisation that advocates and represents sustainable energy technologies, primarily solar photovoltaics, or as we refer to it as solar PV, and also BESS, which simply stands for Battery Energy Systems. So BESS is simply a mechanism to collect the excess energy that may be produced from solar and can be used at any other time when the sun is not shining.
Great. And so who does SEANZ primarily represent? What part of the industry is your focus?
SEANZ represents the whole supply chain within New Zealand. That simply means those that manufacture these products or these technologies from around the globe. We have a whole bunch of large stakeholders, through to those who wholesale and distribute the technologies, to those guys who are on roofs installing the technology, to those guys who are designing systems to be installed, and also at utility scale level, those organisations that finance solar farms, those organisations that develop and build them. So the developers, builders and funders are all part of the SEANZ group, and we represent their interests at policy level as best as we can at government, ministerial, local government level, and essentially advocate for the wider industry.
Okay, that's a really good overview. Thanks, Brendan. I guess the next question is, broadly speaking, where does the New Zealand industry stand at the moment? What are the big issues that are facing the industry?
Well, essentially the take-up of solar at residential, commercial and industrial level has been relatively slow. And look, we measure that in a bunch of different ways. One of the key reasons the development in this country has been slow or hasn't been as fast as other countries, because we often get compared to Australia, is primarily because New Zealand already has a very high percentage of renewable energy generation. Last count, last quarter, we're at 84%. When we compare that to countries like Australia, when they first started on what they called the solar coaster, originally their numbers were down around around or less than 6% of generation was coming from renewable energy. Now, we're talking a good 12 to 14 years ago. Their take-up of solar in Australia right now is close to 30% of households and commercial and industrial buildings. Compare that to New Zealand, we're at less than 3%. So, and that's as I said, that's primarily because of the non-requirement to drive solar uptake, unlike Australia. Lots of other countries, including Australia, have been motivated essentially to push that renewable energy generation portfolio by using subsidies or feed-in tariffs. There's simply a mechanism to drive the uptake. In New Zealand, we've never had feed-in tariffs or never had subsidies. SEANZ has always taken a position way back in the early years where we essentially do not advocate for subsidies. We don't want subsidies here. Having seen the effects that subsidies can have and do have in other countries and jurisdictions.
What is that effect, Brendan?
Well, essentially, it builds a false economy. Example, if you decide, Jonathan, that you want to install solar and there's a subsidy available, what's to stop the next government from taking that away? Classic example in New Zealand, the current coalition government removed subsidies for electric vehicles. So if you invest in a solar system and you expect your payback to be X number of years, that is compromised by a subsidy and it gets taken away, you're left carrying the baby.
Right, that's interesting.
So that's primarily happened in a few countries. Australia went through that a few years back. It also happened in Japan. Japan, in 2011, after the Fukushima nuclear disaster, they made a decision to implement substantial subsidies to drive solar uptake. It happened. Change of government, they slowly started taking it away. So that's a key factor for us. We don't want to leave consumers essentially in the lurch at any one particular time. It may be great for the industry at the time. It might be great for those guys who are out there selling and installing it. And listen, we've had many people approach us about advocating for subsidies, but that's a no-go as far as we're concerned. So some of the other issues and challenges that the industry faces in New Zealand are based primarily around the current state of infrastructure in New Zealand in the electricity sector. I'll refer to a number of reports that have been completed over the last 4 odd years. One of those reports identified that investment in our EDBs or our network operators, of which there are 29 in the country, require over $11 billion worth of infrastructure spend to bring their networks up to speed. Now, that's a significant amount of money. Bringing them up to speed to cater for the connection of solar PV and batteries, so they can, so the system can essentially take the electrons both ways. So a retailer of electricity can sell the power, the lines company or the EDB distributes the power to the building, residential, commercial, or industrial. So it's a one-way system. It was always designed as a one-way system. But of course, once you start installing solar and you have excess generation, you add a battery to that, and you may want to export that battery or energy from that battery and be paid for it. You need a two-way power flow system.
And as it stands right here and now in New Zealand, is the system capable of doing that?
Some parts of it are and other parts are not. As an example, we have some parts of the infrastructure within New Zealand and some of these EDBs or these lines companies. And look, and this is no disregard or disrespect for them, but some of them, they will not allow batteries or solar PV to be connected to specific parts of their networks because their network is not designed to carry power the other way. And in their view, it creates a bunch of other technical issues that need to be addressed.
So what is the next step for solar in New Zealand then? What is the big infrastructure issues that we need to solve, and whose job is it to solve them? Is it the networks?
Well, there's a number of ways you can look at this. Obviously, those network operators operate in a monopoly, and they operate in a position where the rate of return for their stakeholders is governed by the Commerce Commission. They can generate a return based on the number of what we call ICP, which are essentially the meters in the properties, spread throughout their geographical or jurisdictional area. Example, in Auckland, we have Vector, and Vector have X number of ICPs. So it's not hard to calculate the revenue generation that can come from those ICPs based on historical data and the rate of return that's required from that revenue. From there, it's easy to crunch the numbers and work out exactly what's required to help develop or maintain the assets that you have, i.e. poles and wires, transformers, what may be put underground for underground power. So the process is is reasonably complex, but if we try and simplify it for everyone to understand, it's based on ICP numbers, the growth of those ICP numbers, historical volume of energy usage, which can define the price and therefore the return.
And does that then have to go back into developing this infrastructure so we can move forward in terms of solar, do you think?
That return needs to cater for the development of the networks to carry power both ways.
Right.
It's like the size of the pipe. Is the pipe big enough to take it one way and send it to the residential property, or is it big enough to take it both ways? So that's a challenge for network operators, but it's also a challenge for the consumer. So it's a very fine balancing act, and the Commerce Commission manage and regulate that in a manner that works from a financial perspective for all, not forgetting the fact that the Electricity Authority, as the regulator, which controls and manages and regulates essentially how they act to make this happen, is a key part. They have that responsibility, and how they deal with that varies from lines company or EDB or network operator to network operator, because they have to deal with geographical issues. What applies in Auckland doesn't apply in the South Island, maybe where we have around the Queenstown area, because of the hills, because of the remarkables, because of, as I say, the geographical positions, which may not also apply to somewhere like the Central Plateau in the country, where they have a very large area, but they have a minimal number of consumers using power in those areas because it may be the least populated area. So there's a whole bunch of challenges that they have to work with. We do our best in terms of our communication with them, the issues that we see and how we can try and help them develop some of those solutions.
So speaking of the Commerce Commission and the government in general, what is it like working with the government? Are they responsive to the needs of the solar industry? Are they listening to industry bodies like SEANZ?
Look, that's a really interesting question, Jonathan. Over the years, it's varied. At one stage, way back in the early years, we're going back about 12 to 13 odd years ago, there was very, very little help from government agencies. And like everything with any type of new technology, it's always viewed as a little bit suspect. We're certainly over all those issues now. So yes, we have received significant help in terms of trying to drive change over the last 5 or 6 years. Having said that, there are still issues and challenges to work through with the current government, and that is currently a work in progress. Right.
And so where is the industry at then in terms of, say, frameworks and standards? Are there standards that the whole industry is working to, or are we still at that stage where we're kludging all of this stuff together?
Again, that's a really good question. There are specific standards that are applicable. Example, both Australia and New Zealand share the same technology standards for this solar PV and battery technology. If we try to go alone and do this by ourselves and develop our own standards, we would have a whole bunch of issues because essentially we don't have the scale here that interest manufacturers in developing the technology to the standards that we might set or we might want for ourselves. With a population of 5.4 million people, we do not have enough scale compared to, 25 million in Australia and other jurisdictions where it's considerably larger. So we have to hold hands with Australia and work closely with Australia and use the same standards. So those standards, yes, do get developed between ourselves under Standards New Zealand, but we have some roadblocks in this country that limit the progress on how quickly they can be developed.
Okay, what kind of things get in the way, Brendan?
The technology used to take the solar or output from a solar system that can be used within the building and put out back out to the grid is a device called an inverter. There is a specific standard that is used or must be set up in that device, in the inverter, before it can be implemented in New Zealand. It must meet that standard. The current standard in New Zealand dates back to 2012.
Wow, that old. That's surprising to me, given what a quick-moving industry solar is. And so that's the standard that we're all working on currently.
That particular standard is the one that is currently cited in law. In New Zealand, a standard cannot be actioned and put in play in our industry, but in actual fact in most industries, unless it is cited in law. Unlike Australia, once it's cited, a transition period is defined. It might be 6 months, it might be a year, and then it comes into play. In New Zealand, it must be cited in law. Now, this is a piece of legislation that goes back God knows how many decades. So that simply means for it to be cited, it has to go through this huge bureaucratic process before it comes out the other end, where it can be legally cited. Once it's cited, that means it can be gazetted, and then it can be put in play. Example, based on previous iterations of this particular standard and others, it can take 4, 5, 6 years before they come into play, once they're actually approved and authorised by the standards group. So this 2012 standard, even though we have a 2020 standard, that's an 8-year difference. We're now in 2024. It's another 4 years. It's 12 years. Some of the issue is a bureaucratic process in our, we believe, and look, I've had many a conversation with ministers, government ministers around the standards process, and also with those who officiate in these processes with very little progress.
I can believe it, Brendan.
And look, that may be, I don't think it's necessarily an issue with a minister. It's more an issue around the process or the regulation that manages the process. It needs to be changed. And I can share with you, we have had one minister who has tried to change that process in the previous government. But of course, we know what happened in October last year.
We do. So, if you had the ear of the current coalition government and you could sort of speak your piece or wave your magic wand, what would you be asking for, Brendan?
4 particular standards that affect the solar PV industry to be highlighted, to be pushed through, and to be cited in law within 6 to 8 months' time. That requires a whole bunch of lobbying. That requires a whole bunch of additional work now that we have another government in play. Those wheels are already turning. That's not to say it's suddenly going to happen, because it's our view that this particular government has a bunch of other priorities in place around the energy space, especially around fast-tracking processes for getting large-scale solar and wind and other types of technologies in play, because obviously that's where the big hits come. When it comes to residential, commercial and industrial solar, we expect it will be a little bit slower.
So how are we doing in terms of large-scale solar farms? How many have we got in play already? And, are there more underway?
Currently, there is less than 10 megawatts of solar farms in operation in this country right now. Now, 10 megawatts is not a sizable amount once we start talking about utility scale. However, there is almost, from our understanding right now, given the visibility that we have of what's in development, at Transpower level, there's less than 65 that are going through a process that may take 2 to 3 years before they come out the other end with a yes, we're proceeding with this development, or no, we're not, or go away and do some more homework. As you can imagine, if you're going to build a solar farm, there's a whole bunch of stakeholders in play, from the landowners, the developer, which is essentially the project developer who's going to develop the project. You need a funder. You need someone to fund what you're going to do. The consenting processes can be long. If you are talking with Transpower, their consenting processes around the viability of the project, whether you can connect to their backbone throughout the country at a specific point. The technical requirements are a significant key part here. So when you consider all of those, it is not surprising that today there is a long-winded process to go through. And we hadn't even started talking about resource management.
So from an industry perspective, the government's plans to put in place, these fast-tracking processes, that's just got to be a good thing, doesn't it? Removing the bureaucracy, cutting the red tape, and just getting on with business.
Is it a good thing? From our perspective in the industry, yes, it is a good thing. From other perspectives, it may not be such a good thing, given potential issues around biodiversity. There are a bunch of other issues.
Sure.
So there are around 65 in that process. Now, that's only at Transpower level. In New Zealand, there is no visibility around solar farm development at distribution level, i.e. the 29 lines companies. There is absolutely no visibility at all, and it's very hard to understand what is in play or potentially in play. We can make some guesses because we do have some of those distributors who are members of ours, and some of them have shared some of that information. What's fair to say is this: if we look at the range and the scale, there are some rather significant ones that are in play in that process. The largest one that I'm aware of is around 400 megawatts, which is in the Kinloch area. That is in the process of seeking consents. There are a whole bunch of others that vary from about 2 megawatts up to 100 megawatts, spread throughout the key areas in the country where there is good solar irradiation. Northland, the Eastern Bay of Plenty, the Taranaki area, some in the Central Plateau, and for some reason a whole bunch around the Canterbury area and south of Canterbury. There are some smaller ones being developed in the Nelson, Marlborough area, obviously because it's very sunny there. So yes, there is a whole bunch in play in the pipeline. It's estimated by Transpower that there's probably around about 11,000 megawatts. Now, if you look at it in terms of total capacity, it's 11,000 megawatts. New Zealand, current generation level, is at less than 9,000. So to put it in perspective, there's around 11,000 in the process. And I just need to clarify this. That doesn't mean that 11,000 megawatts is going to get built. It's in the process. Current generation capacity is around about the 9,000 mark. How much do we need by 2050? Look, the jury's out on that. There are so many different reports with so many different numbers. Estimations of 40% increase from today to 2050 to 100%. Bottom line is, as most politicians in the space will know, we need as much as we can get, whether it's from centralised generation, whether it's solar farms, wind farms. Of course, as the organisation who represents sustainable energy, those are the two key ones. If we look at international trends, that's where it's at. More investment has been made in the last 4 years in solar and wind than any other type of generation globally.
Okay, so in terms of that, in terms of hitting that 2050 goal, turning the key for New Zealand, in preparation for this conversation, I was doing some research and I read there's a global skills shortage in terms of sustainable energy skilled workers. By 2030, there'll be a 7 million skilled worker shortfall for climate and energy projects, such as installing solar panels. Is that an issue here in New Zealand as well? Do we have the people to do what we need to do?
That's another really great question, Jonathan. Bottom line is, in New Zealand, no, we do not have the capacity at this point in time to deal with significant growth.
Interesting.
So SEANZ has been through the exercise to understand, using a bunch of international formulas to understand what is required as the industry grows. How do we do that? We do it rated by megawatt capacity. In other words, example, how many employees are required in a bunch of different roles to install 1 megawatt of solar rooftop level, which is residential, commercial, industrial. That's a different number to installing 1 megawatt of solar in a solar farm. It's a different skill set. So we've been through the exercise several times to understand what that looks like and build a forecast out to around 2035 of the numbers required. So look, we're still refining that report because of some other work that we're doing with some government agencies. And I think it's fair to say, when we've shared these numbers with a number of government agencies, one in particular fell off their chair. The numbers are huge. The economic development potential and employment is significant in this space.
So when then does the revolution get here, Brendan? When do things start to snowball?
If we're talking about rooftop solar, the question we ask ourselves is, where is the tipping point? Where it suddenly goes from, currently around about 800 rooftops are installed with solar a month. Is it at 2,000? Is it at 3,000? So if we base it upon 2,000, that could be a significant change point where escalation happens. Today, the economics of rooftop solar are in no doubt. If you currently pay in Auckland around about 34 cents a kilowatt hour for your electricity, you put in solar today in Auckland, guaranteed, absolutely guaranteed it will be beneath 12 cents. You will pay less than 12 cents a kilowatt hour. If that price dropped down lower than 12 cents, where does it have to get to? Is the tipping point another 5 cents or 6 cents? Where the savings becomes so great, the payback period is less than 2 to 3 years, that could be another tipping point or another driver to make it all happen.
So what's the consumer appetite like at the moment as it stands?
It's based on essentially, look, there are 3 or 4 drivers, and we've completed a number of surveys around this to understand and get our heads around it. And the same top 3 or 4 points keep coming out. The first one is the economics of how much money I can save. That's always the number one driver. How long is that payback period going to be? If I'm paying 34 cents a kilowatt hour today, I put in solar tomorrow, what is that payback period? And right now, the payback period is less than 4 years.
4 years, that's not too bad, is it?
For a typical average system, it's less than 4 years. The key demographic that fits into that space are those baby boomers who simply want to lock in a fixed price for the utilities. Those who are moving into retirement, that's a significant number of the audience who are participating in the solar industry. They want to lock in utility costs as they move into retirement.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
They can do it in electricity. You start thinking a bit wider. How else can I do that? Oh, can I do that with my motor vehicle? Yes, let's buy an electric vehicle. If I'm going to put solar PV in with a battery, I might as well have an EV too. I can charge it from the sun. Oh, that cost of petrol comes down. Oh, there's no cost of petrol. So they're saving big time. The next big factor is one would or we often get asked firstly about, is it the green factor? Is it because they want to save the planet? And that typically comes towards the end of the priorities.
Yeah, I can imagine. Money talks, right? Now, Brendan, we're just about out of time here, but for the folks at home, what's the key takeaway here? What's the message you really want to get out there?
10, 12 years ago, in actual fact, probably up until about 5 or 6 years ago, the SEANZ organisation, its board and all its operations teams spent most of its time defending solar. It was all about, yes, solar is good for these reasons. Today, that debate doesn't happen. Why does it not happen? Everyone clearly understands that there is a benefit of generating your own power. As many consumers tell us, it's a sexy thing to do. It's sexy. You're making your own power. Well, I'm going to buy it from a utility. So it is now the debate. That debate's gone. It's more about driving the uptake of solar. The gap we think that exists is more people understanding the value of what it is. So the economics work. If anyone is ever in doubt about that, go to our website, seanz.org.nz, click on Solar Optimizer and go through. It's an educational process that will calculate and tell you how much money you can save. The gap we see is a greater requirement, greater help in educating more people about the benefits of solar at residential, commercial and industrial level, at rooftop level. The more people that understand its value, I think the more people we will have working towards implementing their own systems on their own roofs. So that whole education process, I think, becomes very important. How we can do that is a work in progress.
Good stuff. Thank you, Brendan. Lots on the horizon there. Thanks for joining us today. And thank you too to our listeners for tuning in. That's a wrap, folks. If you like what you've heard here, please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and drop us a line with your feedback, topic ideas, or anything else you'd like to get off your chest. I'm Jonathan Cotton. This was the Totally Connected podcast, brought to you by Entelar Group, the Total Connection Company. Till next time, be good, stay safe, and see you in a bit.